That's the image that Zechariah wants to portray. When you lay your hands on God's people, you're laying your hands on the apple of His eye. You could not touch anything more sensitive to Him than to touch His people. As we turn to this passage, we are turning to one of the most difficult passages in the entire New Testament. In fact, certainly one of the most difficult passages in Mark's Gospel. This is a passage that presents us with difficulty in at least three ways. It is difficult for us because, as you'll see in just a moment as we read through the passage together, the content of the passage is a difficult content. The subject is a difficult subject. That'll be obvious to us all as we read through it. So it's difficult because of its content. It's also difficult because of the text. We are no stranger by this point to the fact that Mark's Gospel is the book in the New Testament that has the most what we call textual variance of any book of the New Testament. That means that most often in Mark's Gospel, more than any other book in the New Testament, we come across questions because there will be variants or variations between manuscript evidence. And so Mark's Gospel presents us with a number of those. This passage before us presents us with more of those textual variants than any other passage, all the way up until the final big one, so to speak, which we would refer to as the longer ending or the shorter ending of Mark's Gospel in chapter 16. So it's difficult because of the content, it's difficult because of the manuscript evidence, but it's also difficult because of the imagery. Jesus will use imagery in this passage that is foreign to us. It's not native imagery to us. Specifically, He will use two images put together that for us don't seem to go together. We will have to endeavor, we will have to turn on our thinking, so to speak, in order to follow Jesus' train of thought because of the images that He's using. But in addition to that, just the content itself is a content for us to wrestle with. So let's begin this morning. We'll read the whole passage together and then we'll begin working through verses 42 through verse 48. So beginning from verse 42, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. So as we begin the passage, we would be tempted right away to think that Jesus is now teaching about some sort of lesson due to the maltreatment of children, as He says that whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, and then He goes on with some consequences, or to say it would be better for this person if these other consequences came upon them. So we'd be tempted to think that Jesus is now teaching about something to do with the mistreatment or the maltreatment of children, particularly since He just used a child as an illustration, and He will use a child as another illustration, shortcoming in chapter 10. So we would think that He's talking about children, maybe the mistreatment of children, those who don't treat or love children well, but instead Jesus is not speaking of children. When He speaks of little ones, He's speaking here of those who would be believers in Him, followers of Him, but young in their faith, young in their experience, young in their doctrine. So these little ones that He says, whoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me, who believe in me to sin, is going to use this word sin or cause to sin. He'll use it throughout the passage. Each time He uses this word, this is the word scandalizo, We get our word scandalize from it. And so in its verb form, it's found often in the New Testament. In its verb form, it literally means to cause to stumble. So some of your translations may translate it more literally, whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble. Or as our English Standard translates it, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, to scandalize, to be tripped up, to be stumbled, to cause them to stumble. In its noun form, the noun form is also found often in the New Testament. In its noun form, it literally means the trigger stick of an animal trap. So in your mind right now, you can go ahead and go back to those Saturday morning Bugs Bunny cartoons, and there's the box turned upside down with a carrot underneath the box and a little stick holding up one end of the box with a string tied to it. And then Bugs comes along and takes the carrot, the string is pulled, and then the box defies the laws of gravity and doesn't fall down. You know how that goes. But that's the imagery that you have, that literally that stick, that's the trigger stick to pull that out and to entrap the one that you wanted to entrap into that trap. So this is the image that Jesus is presenting for us. We are to have this image in our mind, this context in our mind of entrapment into sin. Not just happening into sin, not just sort of forgetting to obey or not being diligent enough in obedience, but Jesus has in mind the entrapment to sin. So whoever entraps or causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him. And now Jesus is going to use some other imagery here that's quite powerful. The first imagery that he's going to use is this imagery of the millstone. He says it will be better for him if a great millstone were tied around his neck or attached to his neck and then thrown into the sea or cast into the sea. So this imagery of a millstone, we're familiar probably with millstones. We don't use them today, but we're probably familiar with millstones. Millstones would come in a smaller variety that could be used maybe around home with one person. A woman could use a millstone to take the grain and put the grain between the two stones and grind it into a flour. But this is not the type of millstone Jesus is speaking of. Notice here it says a great millstone. So the millstones that Jesus would be referring to were plentiful in ancient Israel. Many archaeologists have found them. They were giant stones. Picture in your mind something like the size of maybe a tractor tire. Two of these round stones together, there'd be a hole so that you could insert the grain into the hole. And the only way that these stones could be turned was by the power of beasts of burden. They were far too heavy for a person to move or to turn. But ironically, there was one instance in which it was moved by a man, and I'm speaking there of one of the forerunners of Christ, Samson, the strong man, the forerunner who was the forerunner strong man. In Judges 16, we read that in his humiliation, as the Philistines had captured him, they gouged out his eyes, they blinded him, and then they made him to be a beast of burden. In his humiliation, he was lowered to the status of a donkey to go around and around and around in a circle all days. Maybe you've seen pictures or videos of how that's done, around and around and around. So that's the imagery, this massive, massive stone that no person could move. Jesus says it would be a better option. Those who cause these little ones, these young ones in faith, these who are unsophisticated in their faith, these whose faith is young and they are not yet resolute in their faith, those who would cause them or entrap them to sin, a better option for them, their status would be improved if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. So there's the third imagery that Jesus uses there, of the imagery of the sea. So keep in mind, as we read about the sea in the Scriptures, we need to read about the sea through the lens of an ancient Jewish person instead of the lens of a modern American person. Many of us probably enjoy the sea. Many of us probably go to the beach and enjoy sitting by the beach as the waves are coming in. And we would say, what about that? We would say that is calming and restful, wouldn't we? No ancient Jew would say that, because to the Jewish person, to the ancient Jew, the sea was a place of great danger and fearfulness. It was a place that represented chaos on earth. It represented the rule of evil on earth. Remember the two calmings of the sea? We talked all about that, about how the sea represented, it was like a metaphor for the rule of chaos and evil on earth. And so to the ancient Jewish person, the sea, you would never go to the sea to sit by the sea and relax, because the sea to you would be a place of danger, a place of evil, a place of unknown. And so there's the last imagery, to be cast into this place of evil, this place of chaos where certain death would occur. So think of the image that Jesus is presenting here. It is a horrible image. It's death, Jimmy Hoffa style. It's like gangster death. To take someone, chain them to this great big massive stone, take them out on the water, and throw the stone overboard. Jesus says that would be an improvement for that person. Those are harsh words. So what happened to our nice, gentle Jesus? What happened to our nice, kind Jesus who never says an unkind thing about anyone? The blonde-haired, curly-haired, the curly-haired, blonde-eyed Jesus, blue-eyed Jesus, blonde eyes, blue-eyed Jesus. Whatever happened to that Jesus who never speaks a harsh word? Well, that Jesus, of course, is a fabrication of our modern imaginations. This is the Jesus of the Gospels who will speak such harsh words to say, it would be better for this horrid death to come upon you. So just think of the death that would ensue. Just think of the fear. Just think of the horrible situation to be on that boat and to see that gigantic stone and the chain from the stone to around your neck or around your leg, and to know that once that thing is thrown into the sea, it's going down fast and you're going with it. We read that drowning is not only one of the most frightening ways to die, but it's also one of the most painful ways to die. To have the lungs fill with water, to try to breathe water, is we're told, one of the most painful and certainly frightening ways to die. And so Jesus says that would be an improvement. So what is Jesus saying here? Jesus here, if we could harmonize this together with Matthew's account, which we believe is the same instance, then we would see that Jesus is addressing here the world. Look with me in Matthew's account, Matthew 18, verses 6 and 7. You'll see the similarity, but you'll also see that Matthew gives us some additional information. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it will be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. All that parallels with Mark. But now, Matthew gives us additional words from Jesus. Woe to the world. Woe to the world for temptations to sin. For it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. So Jesus now says plainly, let me apply this for you. What I am saying here is woe to the world, to the unbelieving world who would tempt my little ones to sin. So he's speaking here a powerful word against the non-believing world ruled by the God of this age who would tempt or entrap or ensnare His little people to sin. So the first thing that we see here to make note of is the fierce protection of God, the fierce protection of the Father for His people. The fierce protection that we're reminded of in places like Zechariah, in which Zechariah says that whoever touches God's people touches the apple of His eye. You know what it's like to touch? Now the apple is a metaphor that means the pupil. You know what it's like to touch the pupil? If I were to come up to you right now and poke you in the pupil, then how would you respond? You would respond quite harshly and quite radically, because to be touched on your pupil is not something comfortable at all. You would lash out against that person touching. And so that's the image that Zechariah wants to portray. When you lay your hands on God's people, you're laying your hands on the apple of His eye. You could not touch anything more sensitive to Him than to touch His people. So this comes to the disciples, I think, as a great comfort. But the woe that is spoken to the world is a woe that we should just pause and take note of. Jesus says temptations will come. We live in a fallen world. This is the design of the Father, that after the fall of man into sin, He does not save His people and remove them from this world. Rather, they continue to live out their salvation in a world that brings temptation to them. So Jesus says that will happen. That will come. But woe to the one by whom it comes. And Jesus clearly says here, not just the temptation that believers encounter by seeing other people, seeing non-believers doing sinful things and thinking, oh, that looks like fun. Maybe I could do that. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the ensnarement, the entrapment to sin that will come at the hands of the world. So let's just think for just a moment, and I want to just go through some examples of how we see this happen in our world today. And I want to do this just to help us to see how prolific this particular thing, this exact thing is. Just how prolific this happens in our world today. This idea that the unbelieving world works at bringing temptation to believers, puts effort into bringing about the stumbling of believers into sin. So as I thought through some of the ways that we see this happen today, you will, I think, agree with me that these are so plentiful and so abundant that we'll all immediately be reminded that we live in a world that is absolutely filled with this type of not just temptation by observation, but temptation by intentional and purposeful entrapment. Think with me of some examples. You could just start with the example of greed. Greed is a sin that today in our modern world we have demoted greed from one of the 7 deadly sins to almost a positive thing, but the scriptures are very plain. Greed is a mortally deadly sin. And our world in which we live constantly applies its effort into focusing and touching upon that greed in your heart to say, you need this. Let me show you this. This is something you got to have. Your life won't be complete until you have this. Now that this new thing is invented, you got to have this. You won't be happy until you have this. This will solve all your problems. This will make you happy. This will change your life forever. Over and over again, we live in a world that repeatedly says to us, lust for this, desire for this, crave this, covet this. That is the world in which we live, and it is not by accident. People work literally overtime to come up with new marketing ways to tap into the greed of the human heart. Now, that's not to say that there are no Christian marketers and that everyone who works in marketing and advertising is a sinful unbeliever. But it is to say that that is a field of expertise in which people are educated and trained and skilled to specifically tap into the sinful greed of the human heart and say, let me make you even greedier. Let me make you even more covetous. So I thought about that, but then it only goes downhill from there. I thought about, well, what about probably the biggest temptation to sin that all of us would share, in that most of the people in the room probably right now have this temptation to sin right on you, right on your person. Some of you probably have it in your hand as I speak. And of course, I'm speaking of that little device that we all cannot be separated from called the smartphone. That little device that connects you immediately to the entire world, to anything that you want to see, anything that you want to learn about, any piece of information, any video that you want to watch. Any type of entertainment that you may desire is immediately available to you. So we probably, very few of us, probably really have an understanding of just how sophisticated the algorithms are in almost everything that has to do with your smartphone, with how sophisticated those algorithms are to tap into the sinful nature of your heart and draw you in further and further and further. Right now, there are people that are intelligent, that are highly specialized, that are trained, that right now they're working on algorithms to cause you to be pulled in more effectively and more deeply into all of the things, or nearly all of the things that a smartphone does. Have you ever said to yourself, oh, maybe let me just open up my video watching app, YouTube or something like that, me just watch a video. I'm just going to watch this one video. And then 45 minutes later, you've now watched 12. Has that ever happened to you? And you're like, what? How did that happen? Or did you ever open your social media app and just think, I'm just going to scroll for 30 seconds here. I just want to see something real quick. And then an hour later, you're still mindlessly scrolling. That's not because that you're just an idiot. That's because you have been entrapped by sophisticated algorithms that watch everything that you do on your phone. They watch everything you do. Everything you click on, everything you like, everything you comment on. They watch how quickly you scroll past everything. And all of that is fed into massive algorithms that have one design, and that's to pull you in and to draw you in further. And that's why that happens. Now, this is not to say that there are people who are sitting around saying, let me just find out new ways to make Christians sin, because I just love making Christians sin. That's not what we're saying. Because all of this is monetized. Their ultimate goal is money. But notice Jesus didn't even allude to their goals. In a sense, he doesn't care what their goals is. What he's speaking of is their actions to entrap God's people into sin, deeper and deeper into sin. So we could talk for a long time just about that. But then I thought, of course, where there's a real obvious example when we start speaking about recreational drugs. We start speaking about the whole gamut of recreational drugs that are available to us today, things like LSD, things like fentanyl, meth. You talk about heroin and on you could go. Do you know none of those things occur naturally? None of them. Not one single thing of all those occurs naturally. They are chemical combinations in which chemical engineers have specifically designed these things for the intention of hooking you and hooking you fast, of causing your body to be physiologically addicted and to do it quickly and powerfully. And so there are literally, this is no exaggeration, there are literally chemical engineers who applied their learning and their knowledge and their trade in order specifically to draw you or to draw people into this sinful pattern of life. And this is what they do. This is exactly what Jesus is speaking of. Woe to such people who entrap my people into sin. So I thought about that. But then I kept on thinking, and we could just keep on going further with for example, the tobacco industry. Most of us are in the room are old enough to remember when we were a more tobacco-friendly culture. We're not a tobacco-friendly culture anymore, and thank goodness for that. That's not to say we don't have plenty of smokers in our culture and tobacco users in our culture, but we're no longer a tobacco-friendly culture. But that took many, many decades in order for that to happen. So some of us in the room are probably old enough to remember when tobacco usage was not considered necessarily unhealthy, and there may be a few of us old enough to remember when it was thought to actually be healthy. And it actually took decades and decades of the tobacco companies lying about the addictiveness of their product. Anybody remember that? The outright lying of tobacco companies of the addictive nature of their product. It took decades to get past that. And literally, this is no exaggeration, there are chemical engineers who have worked for the tobacco industry for decades, that their job is to make their product more addictive, to engineer their products so as to be more quickly and more powerfully addictive to those who use it. This is precisely what Jesus is speaking of. So we could talk about that. We could also talk about some of us in the room listened to a daily podcast in which this past week, one of the subjects that came up was the negative political ads and how studies have shown that the percentage of negative ads now dominates. The vast majority of political ads are now negative. What's that doing? That's tapping into your sinful desire to hate. And it's saying these ads are more effective and they produce better results because they tap into the human nature of hatred. We love hating people that are different from us. We love hating people that are against what we believe in. And so that's what that's tapping into. And it's saying, let me draw you in further. Let me entrap you further into the sin of hate. Or what about the industry of gambling? You might say, well, gambling is just one of those, it's sad to see people, you go to the convenience store and you got to wait in line for the person buying all the lottery tickets. And it's just sad to see that, because oftentimes you just know the person really can't afford it. They shouldn't be doing that, but they're spending their money, and it's just really sad to see. You might say that. Or you might say, gambling, people have always gambled. It's one of those things. But you know what? We now live in a country in which 48 states have legalized gambling. And I'm not speaking so much about gambling on sporting events or gambling on the horse races or something like that. What I'm speaking of is the organized gambling on the part of your government. Your government is invested heavily in the gambling industry. And so let me tell you a little bit about what the gambling industry is all about. Some years ago, I read a book that was about a different subject, but it had a chapter in it about gambling. And in this chapter, it spoke of some studies in which they observed the human brain. They were doing some sort of scan in which you can observe how the human brain is emitting chemicals into the body. And so they observed the human brain while it was under the influence of different types of things. And so they observed the human brain under the influence of LSD. And they observed a chemical that was released from a certain part of the brain in a certain proportion when the subject was given LSD. They then observed the human brain when it was gambling. And you know what they found? That when the gambler blank, the same chemical was released. What do you think the word in the blank is? That's what you would think. That's not the word. What they found is when the gambler almost won, that same chemical was released. And so what they found was that the body releases a chemical like a high when you almost win. And so the gambling industry has capitalized on that. Because what is the gambling like? What is the lottery and everything like? Do you buy the ticket and you say, oh, that wasn't even close? Doesn't it seem like you almost got it? Oh, 7 of the 10 numbers were there. Oh, that was so close. I had 7 out of 10 numbers. Or, you pull the thing and you get the lemon and then the apple. Oh, so close. No, you weren't. It's designed that way because they've studied it and they've seen the addictive power of making you think you almost won when you never had a chance. And your government, I have no idea if hopefully when this message goes online, somebody from the North Carolina government will hear this. Your government preys on you. P-R-E-Y. Preys upon you because they take advantage of the sinful nature of human beings. They take advantage of the work of people who have studied the brain and say, this is what happens when people think they almost won. And then, wow, we'll make millions upon this. And you think it's all about education. Your government preys on you. This is exactly what Jesus is speaking of. Now, the last example we could talk about would be, we'll just leave it at that. There's more examples we could go to, but I think we've seen it enough, haven't we? We've seen that our world is filled with this same type of thing in which the non-believing world says, let us figure out ways to capitalize on sinfulness. Let us figure out ways to entrap people further into sin. And Jesus' point is, your Father knows this. Your Father has not taken His eye off of you. And those who entrap my people into sin, woe to them. Their state, their condition would be improved with a millstone around their neck cast into the sea, because at least then their guilt would stop. They would stop entrapping more people into sinfulness.